Leading off our discussion tonight are Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. He's an MSNBC political analyst. Tess Bridgeman is with us. She's a former special assistant to the president, Deputy Legal Advisor to the National Security Council, and Associate White House Counsel under President Obama. And Jonathan Alter is joining us. He's a columnist for the Daily Beast and an MSNBC political analyst. And Ben, I want to begin with you on what we learned today about Rex Tillerson's meeting, in which Rex Tillerson basically refused to do what the president wanted him to do for the president of Turkey and for Rudy Giuliani, because Rex Tillerson apparently told the president in the Oval Office it's not legal.
Yeah, well, Lawrence, and first of all, Tess may remember this as well. President Erdogan was raising this case with President Obama in the U.S. Towards the end of our administration, and we were saying, no, we don't get involved in these kinds of investigations. What we're learning here, right, is if you pick up a rock in this administration, you find corruption under it. And, just as we've seen the corruption of our foreign policy in this effort to pressure Ukraine and to leverage U.S. assistance to pressure Ukraine to investigate Trump's political opponents, we see clearly in this story the President of the United States interfering in an ongoing investigation into a violation of Iran sanctions, which he claims to have supported on behalf of this authoritarian leader, Tayyip Erdogan, and Rudy Giuliani, a private U.S. citizen. And those two relationships are really important here, because we also know that Erdogan was able to call up Trump, one authoritarian leader to another, and get him to abandon the Kurds who fought with the United States to defeat ISIS in Syria. And we also know that he has granted this kind of extraordinary role to Rudy Giuliani, where he operates internationally, he engages foreign governments as if he's a U.S. official when he's not. And in all of Rudy Giuliani's comments, including the one that you quoted, he seems to present himself as above the law. And that's what this is all about, this impeachment inquiry, is you have a president and people around him who think that they are above the laws of the nation.
Let's listen to what Rex Tillerson said in a public interview last year about Donald Trump asking him to do illegal things. And it sounds like it happened way more than just once.
When the president would say, well, here's what I want to do, and here's how I want to do it. And I'd have to say to him, well, Mr. President, I understand what you want to do, but you can't do it that way. It violates the law. It violates a treaty. He got really frustrated. I didn't know how to conduct my affairs with him any other way than in a very straightforward fashion. And I think he grew tired of me being the guy every day that told him you can't do that. And let's talk about what we can do.
Tess Bridgeman, when you look at the rough record of that phone call with the president of Ukraine, it looks like there are no more Rex Tillersons in the room telling him what he cannot do.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And it's comforting to hear that Tillerson did stand up to the president on this, among other issues. I mean, if there's one thing that I think we need to keep in mind about this most recent episode, it's that we know that if we're going to remain a society that is governed by the rule of law, there are some fundamental principles that we have to adhere to. And one of them is that the administration of justice has to be impartial. It has to be free of political interference. And if you are a friend of the president's, if you are politically or financially entangled with the president, that should not put you above the law. It's that simple. I think the July 26th memo, what it tells us is that the national security context is something that we need to keep in mind as we're looking at the grave abuses of the president's office and trying to advance his political interests through this call with Ukraine. The striking thing in that July 26th memo to me is the White House staffer saying there was no national security content to that call. Mm-hmm. And that means that the president using it to advance his personal interests had an opportunity cost for our national interest, that it wasn't advanced on that call. We didn't even get there. And that's something that I think it's important to keep in focus as well as we're looking at this.
Jonathan, I want to take a look at a couple more numbers inside the Fox News poll. I want to stress that it is a Fox News poll. I'm sure the president will be attacking it now that it shows majority support for his removal from office. But one question is, is the president getting what he deserves? 48% in the Fox News poll say Trump is getting what he deserves in an impeachment investigation. Only 37% say people are out to get Trump. And then another number in here, the basic question. Is it appropriate for Trump to ask foreign leaders to investigate rivals 66% say no.
See, this is like a mafia shakedown. It's easy for people to understand. They see movies about the mafia. It's not the Mueller report with a lot of complexity that they don't want to get into. And in terms of these documents that they're not going to cough up now, I'm not really worried about that, because the problem is not that there's not a smoking gun. There's not just a smoking gun. There's a smoking artillery range. You know, there is a tremendous amount of evidence that is already in the public record. And so this idea that something more has to be uncovered, he could be, with justification, impeached tomorrow. And what's fascinating is that the American people understand it. So support for Richard Nixon's impeachment did not go above 50% until 2 weeks before he was forced from office and resigned. So that arguably is kind of where we are. Now, it's not going to be that soon before the House impeaches Trump, but we are moving into, at warp speed, the end phase of this in terms of understanding that he has committed impeachable offenses. That is now established fact.
Ben, I want to go back to what Rachel and I were talking about just at the top of the hour here, which is this breaking news report from Axios saying that the House Democrats now are seeking testimony from former Russia advisor Fiona Hill. They're saying they want her at a deposition on October 14th. They want her to turn over documents dating all the way back to January of 2017, dating back to virtually Inauguration Day. And so she's a longtime policy expert. She's a critic of Vladimir Putin. She's someone who's known not to agree with President Trump on Russia. What do you think she might be able to add to the committee's understanding?
She could add a tremendous amount, Lawrence. I mean, everybody who works in kind of the national security community has always wondered why she was working there in the first place, because she's not the kind of person that you'd expect to go along with this relationship where Trump kind of makes himself the junior partner to Vladimir Putin. Presumably, she's been at the nexus of all the contacts that he's had with Putin. She may not have been in the room, but she might have had access to call transcripts. And keep in mind that this Ukraine story is very much intertwined with the Russia story, in part because Russia has invaded Ukraine, but also remember, it's not just that Trump was asking Ukraine to investigate the Biden family. He was also asking Ukraine to investigate this kind of crazy right-wing conspiracy theory that Russia did not intervene in our 2016 election, that it was actually Ukraine. And so Fiona Hill would know a lot about what Donald Trump has said to Vladimir Putin, about whether he's advanced these conspiracy theories, about whether he's sought to absolve Russia for responsibility in interfering in our election, about whether or not Donald Trump has done anything to protect the 2020 presidential election from ongoing Russian interference. She, in documents and in her own testimony, I think could provide an initial roadmap to how Donald Trump has faced this very curious relationship with Vladimir Putin, where he seemed to do everything that Vladimir Putin would want to discredit the United States, to make Ukraine more vulnerable, and frankly, to engage in conspiracy theorizing that lets Putin off the hook for what he did in the 2016 election and what he's likely to try to do again in the 2020 election.
Tess, one of the things I find striking about the Rex Tillerson story tonight is that it is a new story. And there's been a lot of pressure on this White House, journalistically especially, to get these kinds of stories. Michael Wolff had these kinds of stories in his first book exposing the inside of the Trump White House. Bob Woodward had stories like this in there. And yet here's a new one. And it's in an area where Rex Tillerson has already publicly expressed himself, saying that the president asked him to do things that weren't legal. And there's three sources for this story. And it just is another indication of how many people are out there with information that they can release whenever they so choose, either to the committees or to the press.
That's absolutely right. And from the clip that you just showed, Lawrence, it's clear that there are additional instances that former Secretary Tillerson was referring to when he was talking about, for example, conduct that would violate treaties. There's certainly no treaty violation at issue in this most recent episode that's been revealed just now. So that's something completely different. Other violations of laws as well. It's not clear that what happened just now is, or what's being revealed just now is a violation of law. So clearly there's a lot more, even in Secretary Tillerson's experience. But I think you're right that it does also just underscore that really almost any of the officials who dealt personally with President Trump may have further information about improper conduct, as Ben was saying. It just sort of goes to show this pattern of the president putting his personal interest over the national interest really at every turn. And anyone who was within the president's inner circle, within his orbit, may well have been subjected to that and had to make a choice about whether or not they were going to stand up to it or whether they were going to abide by it or be complicit in it.
Jonathan, I just want to go back to the whistleblower and why I gave such short shrift to what was the big, exciting breaking news of the afternoon. Yep. Here's the 2 pages. And, I get the excitement that everybody else does. And I looked at them, I read them, and I just kind of went, okay, it doesn't matter. It's completely proven to be accurate by the phone call itself. But we have the phone call. Right. You care about a document like that when you don't have the phone call. Right.
This, I think you're absolutely right. So think about a guy robs a bank, right? And there's a videotape of him putting a gun to the teller. And then, a couple weeks later, you hear that there's a witness in the bank who's sworn out a statement, that supplements it. It's nice that you have the witness's testimony, but he's been caught red-handed. You don't really need it. All of this is supplemental. Having said that, if Rex Tillerson testified that the president wanted him to break the law, that could be a game changer, and that you then could maybe see support for the president collapsing in the Senate. We're not at that point yet. But there's hope, and if you talk to Bob Schieffer, maybe he'd be willing to talk to a congressional committee.
We will see. Tess Bridgeman, Ben Rhodes, Jonathan Alter, thank you for starting us off tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.